I've been getting a few comments asking about how I do the scales on my 3D models, so today I'm going to show you guys how I do them. First thing you're going to need is your base mesh. This is whatever you're modeling without the scales on it already. I'm just using this plane as my example, but obviously you'll have like a creature model or something like that. So the first thing we're going to want to do is make a duplicate of our base mesh. Obviously, if you're doing this yourself, keep them in the same spot so that making the normal map is easier in the future. But the reason why we duplicate the mesh is because we're going to be using the original one for our retopology, because the new one is going to be kind of bumpy, but the old one will still be nice and smooth, so the finished model has smoother topology. So once we have our duplicated mesh, we're going to go into the sculpting mode, and in here, we're going to enable Die Topo. And I usually set it to constant detail, and I usually set the resolution to something a little bit higher than what the base resolution is to start with. So let's check with the little eyedropper. We're at about 10, so I'm going to bump that up to 30. Now, when you're planning out your scales, you can kind of wing it if you want to. You can also use the little the annotation thingy to like draw out where you want your scales and like kind of plan it. I usually just kind of wing it and figure it out from there, but you know, you can do it however you want. So the most important tool in this whole process is going to be the Draw Sharp tool, or I think it's also known as the Crease tool, and it just draws a little sharp line, like a little indent wherever you draw it. And we're going to be using this to actually draw our scale shapes and put them where we want them. And usually at this point they don't look very good, but that's okay, it's gonna get better. So after we have our little scale shapes drawn on, we're gonna want to turn off Die Topo and go down to the pinch brush and make the brush a little bit bigger so that it has a larger area of effect. And then you're just gonna wanna pinch the edges of the scales together. Get them nice and close to each other. And this is where it all really kind of comes together and starts looking like scales. And if the brush isn't big enough, if it's not pulling enough geometry in, you can always make it a little bit bigger. But this is kind of the point where things start looking a little bit more natural. There you go, there's a nice little patch of scales, and I'm going to take it. Right now it looks a little pixelated because it's got the hard shading turned on, but if we go over into layout and we turn on smooth shading, we get some nice little scale details going on here. And they look pretty good. And some of these look a little soft. If they're too soft looking, you can go back over into sculpting and take your crease brush and just like go right back over them to kind of amp up the divisions between them. And sometimes things will end up getting a little distorted looking. I usually just use the pinch tool over it again to bring it more closer in. And if things are looking really funky, you can always turn on Die Topo and just smooth it out a little bit. And it'll go back to hard shading so you can actually see the geometry. And the important thing here is not to go over the creases that you've made. Only paint the dynamic topology onto the edges that need it. Because if you go over the creases, sometimes it'll like join the geometry together and then you won't get that nice sharp edge. And we want that edge. We want it there because it looks good. And go in, use the smooth tool to kind of smooth it all out. You can also use this technique to kind of like bring up the edges of the scales a little bit if you want them to be a smidgen more defined and you don't want to like carve into your model anymore. Now if we go back over here into our normal viewport and we switch it back to shade smooth, it's kind of cleaned up some parts. And there are some parts that look a little funky, but unless you're working with like a really, really, really big resolution texture, they probably won't show up on the final normal map. But if you are worried about that, you can always just go into sculpting mode, have Die on Topo turned on from the start, and like just very lightly go over all of these edges so that they are the same resolution as everything else. And sometimes if you do this, it will link all of the things together and kind of like fill in what you were doing. So you will have to go back over through it with the crease brush and then also the pinch tool to like get that definition back. But doing this will make it more usable for a really high resolution normal map. I do want to point out though, do not have Die on Topo turned on while you're using the pinch tool, because if you do, it will pull the geometry together and then slowly erase it. So, because it's dynamic topology. So if I show you right here, using the pinch tool, it's not pinching the geometry together in a way that looks the way I want it to. Like that edge is a lot softer than I was intending. But if I turn off Die on Topo and I pinch it together, we get a lot more of a defined edge. So don't leave Die on Topo on when you're actually doing the pinch part of this, because otherwise it will get rid of all of your hard work. So there you go, you can kind of see how it looks more defined over here. This is like a lower poly version, and this is like a higher poly version. And it just depends on how big of a resolution of a normal map you're going with, or how big your textures are going to be when they're done. But you don't have to go crazy, super high detail. You can literally just do this much, and it should look pretty good when it's done. So you can see when I shade smooth, a lot of those artifacting is gone. It's a lot just smoother and nicer looking. And even over here, it still looks pretty good for a lower poly sculpt. So this can be a pretty good option if your computer isn't super powerful. This technique does take a long time and it can be really tedious, but I'm a really big fan of how it looks in the end, so that's why I do it. If you have any other ways that you do scales and you want to share them in the comments, feel free to do so. So this is the end of the sculpting part. Well, not exactly. If you want to add stuff like little ridges and things to the scales, you can. I usually do that. I shift to smooth out the back end of it. And then I use pinch again to kind of make it sharp. And you get a nice little ridge on your scale. And you can even add more stuff like that, like all sorts of little crazy details on your scales. It doesn't even have to be flat. You can get really into it. Kind of like an alligator scale or something. You get the idea. You can really go far with this. So now that we have our scales modeled, we're going to go back to the simple version of the model. As long as you haven't added any like really big spikes or any big protrusions to the model, you can use your original simple sculpture as the base for doing the retopology. And this way you won't have vertices getting snapped to like the bottom sides of the scales and the top sides of the scales and just causing like extra bumpiness to your model. It'll just make it look nice and clean and be a little bit easier to work with. Okay, so once you have your low poly version, I'm just doing a plane because this is a square and it's just an example, so it doesn't actually have to be perfect. And of course, do these all on top of each other, like in the same place so that it actually works properly. You're going to bake your normal map with the scales onto your low poly. If you're unsure of how to bake a normal map, just look up how to bake a normal map. It's pretty straightforward. But yeah, we're gonna move on to texturing now. Okay, so now that we have the normal map applied to our low poly model, you want to make a new image texture that we're going to be applying to the low poly, and we're going to go into the texture paint zone and make sure that you can actually see your normal map texture. And I'm working in the Eevee render so that it's pretty quick and responsive. And what we're going to do now is change the color to white for our brush. And we are going to just paint in between each of the scales. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And obviously this brush is a little bit too big, so I'm going to redo that. I like to usually have the radius set to pressure sensitive and the strength set to constant. There we go. And the reason we're doing this is so that we can set the color of each of the scales to be different than the base mesh, and we can also set the roughness to be different too. And like the metalness and all that. Basically, you can make it so that the scales are distinct from the rest of the model so that the final look of them is nice and looks cool. Also, it's important that you aren't using pure black to define where the scales are, because if you use pure black, it won't really show the shading of them very well, and it'll be really hard to figure out where the edges of the scales are just because it'll be really hard to see. And you can always take this image into like Photoshop or Sci later and adjust the levels so that this black color is true black, so that the selection is basically 100% black, and it makes it easier to edit later. But when you're actually working on it, make it a shade of gray, just to make things easier for yourself. Okay, so now we have the scales all nice and cut out on their own little islands, and we can go into shading and switch this. Instead from color, we can set it to like metallic, or roughness is a pretty good one, so you can actually kind of see how it looks. That's another important thing. When you bake your normal map, be sure to have smooth shading, because otherwise you've got this pixelated effect going on in the shading, and that's not what I wanted. Oops. Anyway, it doesn't matter for this, it's just an experiment to show you guys how it all works. But anyway, so now you can kind of see like what I mean by isolating the scales so that you can change the roughness and all that. And from here, you can like do any sort of colors in your shading. You can like add another image, and you can tone down the roughness because right now it's kind of extreme. But yeah, that is how I make my scales. That's how I do it. It is a very tedious process. Every single part of it is time consuming, but the result ends up looking really cool. I really like it, so I'm just gonna keep doing it this way. So unless you have another way to do it that's like really, really good, that might be easier than this, but still looks as nice, I am always open to input. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.